Morning all. Let's have a look at another interesting game of Magnus Carlsen this morning against Dmitry Jakovenko, who at the time of this game, 2007, was 2735. Dmitry is one of the leading Russian players in the world. Magnus was 2714 at the time of this game, so slightly lower rated than his opponent. So Dmitry kicked off with d4, and we saw Magnus playing the Nimzo-Indian defence. Knight c3 here was played, bishop b4, allowing the Nimzo-Indian defence named after Aaron Nimzovich, one of the leading hypermodernists. Now Dmitry played knight f3 and we saw c5. Now g3, not minding black capturing with c takes d4 here, and that's what Magnus did. In doing so, after knight takes d4, it looks as though white has a nagging advantage. White's prepared for the double pawns. It's looking forward maybe to the bishop pair here, but also d6 looks like a potential trump card for white to make use of. This bishop on the diagonal could exert annoying pressure as well. After castle's bishop g2, Magnus decided to play d5, and now white took on d5, and Magnus didn't play e takes. Maybe he's running into a pin. We'll check this out later. It looks like a liability if he plays e takes here. He actually plays knight takes d5, which has the advantage of course preventing bishop g5 completely. That pin doesn't exist idea, and okay, he might still be left with a slightly weak pawn, but Dmitry actually played queen b3, just putting more pressure, or the same pressure with the queen as it used to be, but from b3 and hitting the bishop. Now we see queen a5, putting more pressure on c3, and white protects the c3 knight a bit more with bishop d2, and then we see knight c6. Okay, so what can white do here? Well, white actually chose knight takes c6, which on the surface at least solves some problems for black, that the d5 knight is now strengthened with b takes c6, and potentially this b file, you could imagine, might be useful for black. But there's a purpose to it. There's some structural issues which maybe white can pick up on later. After castles, Magnus gave up voluntarily now his dark squared bishop with bishop takes c3. Okay, so after b takes c3, he now plays bishop a6, knowing for the moment this pawn is pinned to the bishop in any case, so let's put more pressure on e2. But okay, white in this position just protects the bishop with rook fd1, and the point, I guess, is bishop takes e2, just looking intuitively, is c4 if we have a quick look at this, but we'll check in the second pass through this game. Hitting the queen, hitting the knight, and you might think, well, bishop takes d1, maybe rook takes d1, leaving the knight and queen double attacked, but we'll check that out in the second pass more thoroughly. For the moment here, Magnus decided to get out of that discovery attack possibility with queen c5, and he's marking out c4 with this move. So can white make use of the bishop pair here? Well, e4 kicks away the knight, or tries to, from d5, but it refuses to move for a moment. It's bishop c4, kicking the queen, and now the knight goes back here again with tempo to b6. Queen b4, and Magnus doesn't want an exchange of queens here. An exchange of queens will possibly favour white, with two pawns here ready to roll, the c file ready to put pressure on c6. That structural change might favour white. Magnus played instead queen h5, and we saw bishop f4 now. Okay, bishop f4. And if white gets in bishop d6, there'll be a stranglehold on dark squares, and this pawn's not going to be easy to move after that. So Magnus takes the opportunity to actually play c5 here, kicking the queen, and now contesting that d file bet with rook ad8, and of course the queen on h5 is on d1, so white has to do something about d1. He moves the rook away to e1, and here Magnus prepares to double on that d file with rook d7. An entry point which might theoretically be useful, you might think, is d2, but at the moment it's covered. So is this doubling of rooks going to be effective? After h3, h6 is played, and then we see a4 trying to dislodge this knight from b6. Bishop a6 gives the knight the c4 square, maybe as an option to move forward if needed. And now, okay, an interesting move from white, queen a2. So the queen is making use of this square, putting pressure on that diagonal, and possibly inviting again bishop c4, but black does not take that opportunity there. Let's check that out. Presumably it's harmless. Maybe another queen move to a3 is okay. So rook fd8 is played, and now we see a5 and knight c4. And things sharpen up now, because this is a loose piece on a6. So Magnus must be concerned now about bishop f1, trying to exploit the loose bishop on a6 in playing this knight c4 move. Bishop f1 is indeed played. Okay, the knight cannot move here without losing this bishop. Cannot easily be protected. But we see in this position e5, counter-attacking that bishop. Okay, and there are some tactical possibilities emerging here of great interest. If the bishop moves back, well, if it moves here it can be taken with this knight, or if it moves back, possibly worth investigating tactically in the second part of this game is rook d2, but there's probably other interesting tactics going on here. White played g4 in this position, kicking the queen. Goes to g6, and now doesn't like the look of bishop c1 here. But in any case, with this kicking the queen, this bishop is now protected laterally. So this was an interesting moment. Why kick the queen to protect the bishop, you might ask? We'll have to check out the tactical possibilities of bishop c1 in the second pass for sure. Here, white seizes the opportunity, though, to get a firm grip, it seems, on the d5 square with a bishop which is literally going to be cemented there. Bishop takes c4, offering the dark square bishop, and then we see this bishop d5. Is this bishop really going to suffocate Magnus, or has he got sufficient counterplay on the king side? He's got a queen, he's got this pawn ready as a battering ram. But okay, so f3, and now we see c4, really cementing this bishop on d5. It seems nullifying the rooks for a moment, but visually this construction maybe is better than it actually is. Magnus tests the king side with h5 here, and white reacts with king h2, preparing for rook g1 if hg. But Magnus now pounces onto the dark squares with queen f6, so he's ready for these possibilities, and he's eyeing the rook here. That's to be noted as well. And we see now rook g1 and hg4. Okay, in this position Dmitry does not recapture on g4, but instead plays rook ab1. There may be already some dangerous tactics lurking around behind the scenes here to do with forcing moves available to black and possible rook infiltrations. We'll really need to check out why rook takes g4 was not possible there, or was it a viable alternative to rook ab1. But in this position tactics are unleashed. and it's against white's central construction. This is the clue. So you may be surprised by this move. Next, what does Magnus play here? If I give you 10 seconds to pause the video, or try in the 10 seconds to put the position under great scrutiny, starting from now, what does black play? Okay, Magnus plays bishop takes c4, and this is all of a sudden quite dangerous for white. These rooks are not so bad as they seem behind that bishop on d5 after this. If bishop takes c4, well, there are various possibilities. There are checking possibilities, and there's rook d2 as well. We'll check these out in the second part of the game, but in the game continuation, queen takes c4 was played, and now we see check, which actually creates lateral pressure on the queen. And now, can you see what Magnus plays here? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, rook takes d5, making use of that lateral pin now on the pawn, the loose queen. And Dmitry feels compelled here to give up the queen. So will his two rooks coordinate against black's queen now? Magnus does have this trump card here to make use of, and he makes use of it. It's pass pawn. So are the rooks overloaded? Of the rook d1, there seems to be a faint hope of this, or is it too slow? c3, d6, c2, it seems too slow. Rook d3, and now we see queen c4 threatening the rook, rook e3, and now, okay, queening might be okay here, but Magnus chooses queen c6, which keeps that queening threat and just puts the pawn under lock and key for a moment. The rook goes back, and again queening, okay, d7, is that really convincing? Well, it looks as though the pawn's virtually unstoppable there, so Magnus instead chooses queen c5 in this position. And here, actually, white resigned. This is too fast, this threat of queen f2 and queening here. But you might think d7. So let's now go into a forensic investigation of this game with the evil engines, powerful engines. And there's a new guest as my analytical assistant for this game, if it loads. We do need 3.0. Okay, so it thinks my up by 20 units here. If rook d2, just queen, and that's the end of that basically. There's nothing really for white in this position. Let's go back earlier to see where it all started to go wrong. Where did the Steinitz equilibrium get disturbed for black to get an advantage? At the moment, it seems white had the advantage, and it's easier to play with white usually. So knight takes d5 was the better option here, not e takes d5. If e takes d5, white has significant advantage actually, so it was very important to play knight takes d5. It seems almost a significant advantage. Nice blockade on d4. Okay, so let's go back. Knight takes d5, queen b3, queen a5. White has a small edge out of the opening, and it's recommended, actually, the engine likes knight takes c6 for a bit. What are the alternatives? If knight c2, let's go with this for a moment. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen c7, just offering d5 as a pawn sack. You'll be unleashing bishop h3 if it's taken. This seems actually, this sort of position maybe is nice for black because of that backward pawn. Maybe things like this are going to make use of that c file. This dark square bishop might not be that effective in this position, but it's about equal. So let's go back. So knight c6, white hook takes, and we see about equality here, which is good for black, I guess, from this position. Move 12 is probably a good achievement at this level to get very close to equality. Bishop a6, we see rook d1. Now this tactic, I guess, just check that out. c4 is advantageous to white. Bishop takes d1. Now actually stronger than rook d1 is queen d1 here. You might wonder why. If rook takes d1, okay, queen b6 gets the queens off, potentially, but still an advantage for white, so it doesn't really matter how that's done. So okay, that pawn wasn't taken here. Queen c5, which okay, it's not particularly liked, queen c5, from an engine point of view. Rook ab8 is preferred, and if c4 then queen c5, and that's a slightly different position. Okay, so that's interesting. Queen c5, e4. White seems to be doing okay at the moment, technically. Queen a4, a little bit questionable, perhaps there's queen c2 to avoid knight b6 with tempo. Now if knight b6 here, bishop e3, queen a5. Well, black seems to have a positional grip here on the queen side, so it seems that the evaluation here is biased towards the bishop pair, but black has seemingly a very nice position with few weaknesses. So okay, queen a4, knight b6 with tempo, queen b4. Queen is driven to h5, the engine knights queen h5, keeping the queens on. Bishop f4, and now c5 is light, kicking the queen again. And now rook ad8. And we see here, engine liking rook takes d8, not leaving black with this d file. We've seen how dangerous Magnus is when he's got a rook on an open file. The tactics that generates, the latent tactics of invasion points, is very interesting. So it seems here the engine is preferring rook takes d8 to maintain a small advantage, at least without the two rooks on the board, and that's blocking d1 use, f3, which looks awkward, but white has the dark square bishop, so is it really weakening the dark squares? Black hasn't got a dark square bishop. Maybe white can afford basically to make this apparent weakening move, but if that complex is already good, then weakening it slightly like that is not that exploitable for black with f3. So here a4, and white should be okay. The entry points, the coordination is cut off with f3, and white might maintain an advantage here, at least technically, from engine eyes. But okay, so in the game we left this rook uncontested on the d file. So we see rook d7 after h3, h6, okay, a4, and the bishop drops back now to be able to allow after a5 knight c4. We see queen a2, which isn't actually liked here. Queen a2, g4 is preferred apparently. If knight c4 here, queen a2 or queen c2 now. But again, now look at this queen h4, this change of mind, queen h4. So what is actually happening here with white's king side? Let's go with queen f6, rook d2. This is dangerous for this rook invasion here. Okay, so d2 is a sensitive point. So it seems actually one point of h6 wasn't just a routine to allow the back row to be less of a worry later, but it's actually this g5 potential to kick that bishop to try and get access to d2 sometimes. So anyway, bishop a6, queen a2, and Magnus plays rook fd8. So that invasion point is giving black, it seems black has the tactical pressure. A5 and the knight jumps in. Now after bishop f1, okay, here is where it gets very tactically interesting. Black's move to keep advantage is e5, but g5 is also mentioned. Okay, so e5 we'll go with. So the question here, what would have happened if bishop c1? Maybe it's not rook d2, maybe it's knight d2 in this scenario, just simply knight d2, offering the bishop on a6. And then we have knight f3 check, and we have a loose rook, because this bishop retreat cut off the rooks. We have a loose piece here. And if king f1, check. And this looks very, very dangerous now. If white wants to keep hold of the rook with the king, this is a very dangerous position, it seems. Knight h2 is apparently the most incisive move here. It blocks off f1 and now prepares queen g4. And white is forced for a queen sack. It looks fairly desperate and dire, this position. Let's have a look at, if f3, then there's queen g2 getting mated. So this seems to be the point. The point seems to be that this apparent loose piece on a6 is not that loose. White has created a weakness of the last move, believe it or not, in trying to exploit this loose piece on a6, this f3, and with e5. Okay, now if you might think, well, hold on, okay, there's that bishop d2, and just to make sure you're convinced that knight d2 is powerful, what else is there? You're not going to take here, because then rook takes d2 hits the queen, and that's a disaster surely. And then you might even have rook takes f2 here, and crashing through on white's king. That's not worth looking at. The exchange down there, you might think, well, still, bishop and queen can coordinate here, it seems, and just win back the exchange at least. So knight d2 is very powerful. So that's the idea. It's kind of pouncing on this f3 square. So white decides, the other possibility to check out is bishop c4, of course. Bishop takes c4, e takes f4. Looks as though beautiful possession of the d file, entry point on d2. This doesn't look palatable for white. This position doesn't look at all palatable, just intuitively. So Jakovenko's choice, g4, is probably one of the better choices available to black. In fact, engine likes g4 as a move here at depth 21. g4, kick the queen, even though it's protecting the bishop on a6. But we get this domination, it seems, and blockage of the two rooks. So bishop takes c4, e takes f4, bishop d5. But black has the advantage here, technically, it seems, after f3, which Magnus plays, c4, now h5. And this gets interesting. After king h2, hg, well, the question of hg is raised here as well. If hg in this position, rook g1, we get maybe a similar position to the game. Is rook takes g4 possible in this position? Given that similar to the game, let's just use the game continuation here to get that similar idea. Queen f6 after rook g1. This looks like a mistake, rook g1, which worsens black's position. It seems the engine is preferring just reinforcing d5 with rook ad1. Check, still though, and black has an advantage, surely, if allowed to do this. In this position, it looks dangerous for the king. Queen h5. But at least d5 is actually reinforced here. So cutting down cheapo forcing tactics. Maybe white would even be able to survive. It's coming to 0 here. So it seems maybe a very bad mistake pushing black into a very dangerous, even more dangerous position here. Was this move rook g1, believe it or not. It does allow this very powerful forcing move, bishop takes c4 on the cards. Even here, bishop c4 is on the cards. Magnus chose hg, but let's check out bishop c4, even in this position. Now if queen c4, we'd have a similar tactic to the game with queen f4 and rook d5. If bishop takes c4, rook d2, so the doubled rooks are justified for that entry point. Let's go with bishop f7, trying to distract or exchange off queens, avoiding that with king f8. If the queen moves here, I guess it's end of game. It's mated in 5, in fact. Check. Rook takes f2 is a forced mate for the white king here. So it's worth trying to get to that entry point, even sacking a piece to get rook d2 in. Classic double attack, getting to white's king, which has already been weakened, and this extra kind of piece in Kasparov's view, when a pawn gets around the king, it's another attacking unit, major attacking unit. So this is actually seems to be winning, this idea, bishop c4 here. Magnus chooses hg then, which might have been an inaccuracy, because here white still has a chance now to reinforce d5 with rook ad1. We see the evaluation not too bad. The tactic's gone here. Bishop c4, you just play queen c4 and there's no tactic. d5 is reinforced with the rook. Let's take the rook. So it's important to reinforce d5, and after this the 27-3-5 just crumbled, really, because the bishop, he played in this position rook ab1, which still doesn't reinforce d5. This looks like a big question mark move. So there's still chance for rook ad1. He plays rook ab1 and we get this crushing tactic. Bishop takes c4. Magnus is finding ways into the king here with forcing moves, or to win material. It's a very nifty tactical idea, this check, and rook takes d5, just making use of that loose queen which has been made loose with rook d5. Okay, so white tries queen takes d5 and it's fairly hopeless here, technically. The pawn is triumphant, really. Queen c4. I think just queening may have been okay. Is it a major problem? I would doubt it. Although white's queening here is an unnecessary complication to have. Yes, it's unnecessary complications, but still black would be better technically, but it's not necessary. The way Magnus plays it here, he's attacking that rook, so, and the rook can't go back to d1 now, so the rook e3. In fact, queen f1 is more accurate for force mate. So queen c6, see rook d3. Now in this position, queen c5, which could have invited back rook e3 actually. And okay, I think I might have an engine issue now. Okay, so after rook d2 we saw c1 mating anyway. So if white had repeated with rook e3 in this position, no, actually it's still crushing. You just queen here. If d7, okay, there's queen d2 here, and if we go with this check, king h7, well, there's nothing here. If we queen here, we'll just mate white. So an interesting tactical game where, what can we say about this game? It seemed White had visually a fantastic grip on d5, and it was totally torn apart tactically. Loose pieces at various points in the game, like a6, these entry points, key entry points, were counterbalancing in many cases, and the apparent moves like that, creating weaknesses of the last move, were very observantly under the scenes of the variations being used up for resources for things like knight d2 to get into f3. So a very interesting game tactically from Magnus. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.